job.
That's all coming up for you.
Yeah, she's down there, Anna.
Anna, oh great.
I'm talking to her. And then go to the
Michael, how are you?
We're coming up to the centenary of all the celebrations.
Catherine loves it.
That makes two of us. This is my wife, Georgina.
Oh, Tony does.
You know Tony did. I know. Somebody's trying to get to their park, turn around there, so that the camera gets to see. Enjoy it.
Minister, ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome to Glasnevin Cemetery. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Eddie Nolan, Chairman of the Collins Griffith Society.
Or a Mascot George, Ara, a Chelsea Dala, a Shanadori, a Corlori, obviously Vini Ushna. It's on armoured Dumsa, the Falcha Corroy, on Shohinub, the Relic Glasnevin, on Queenacon Yen and Lynn, our sale of his boss, and Bert R. Untag, Tier Granach, and General Mihal O'Killan, agus Uachtaran Arthur Griffith. Minister, TDs, Senators, Councillors, members of the Defence Forces, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Collins Griffith Commemoration Society, it is my honour to welcome you all here today to commemorate with us the lives and deaths of two great Irish patriots, General Michael Collins and President Arthur Griffith. Two men different in so many ways, in their backgrounds and in their personalities. Collins from rural West Cork, young, charismatic, very much a military strategist and leader. Griffith from urban Dublin, middle-aged, reserved, journalist and academic. Their respect and admiration for each other, however, is well recorded. Their names will be forever linked closely together in Irish history, particularly their roles in the Anglo-Irish negotiations of 1921, their achievement in guiding the agreement through Dáil Éireann, and also, of course, because of their all too premature deaths within a few short weeks of each other. Deaths which have left future generations to wonder what if these two great men had survived into old age. I want to extend a very special welcome to members of the Defence Forces who are with us today for the first time in many years. And some of you may already have noticed that we have a very special guest here in the form of the Sliabh armoured car. And I want to take this opportunity to thank our Defence Forces for making this possible. I also want to extend a very special welcome to our Minister for Justice, Equality and Law Reform, Deputy Francis Fitzgerald. And I want to thank her on behalf of all of us for taking time out from what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to be with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, today is also an important landmark for us, in that for the first time our ceremonies have been organised in partnership with Glasnevin Trust. And I want to take this opportunity to publicly thank George McCullough and his staff at Glasnevin Trust for their help and cooperation over the past few weeks in the organisation of today's ceremonies. New partnerships inevitably, of course, mean changes. And those of you who have attended in the past will notice that there is a change to our routine already here this morning. Our ceremonies today will begin in a moment with the raising of the flag here at the Sigerson Monument by a member of the Defence Forces. And we will then proceed to the grave of Presidents Griffith and Eamon Duggan for wreath laying and prayer ceremonies. Following this, we will then proceed, and in both cases we will be led by Army Piper and the Army Colour Party. And we will proceed from President Griffith's grave to the grave of General Collins, also for wreath laying and prayers. And this, of course, this then will be followed by a memorial lecture, which will be held in the Milestone Gallery, and this year it will be delivered by Dr. David Murphy of Maynooth College. And we will then conclude, ladies and gentlemen, with some light refreshments. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say this is the 92nd year of these annual commemorations, and we are very proud of that continuity. And I would like to take this opportunity to appeal in particularly to younger people to become involved in our society so as to ensure that these ceremonies continue into the future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you enjoy our ceremonies here today, and I would hope that through 1916 and beyond that we will be able to pay a fitting tribute to these two great Irishmen for mBláth. Many of you will know that Eamon Duggan was part of the delegation for the negotiations of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1921, and was a co-signatory with Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins of that agreement. And Eamon Duggan is buried just behind those flags there. And those of you who have been here in the past will know that each year, as part of our commemoration, we lay a wreath at the grave of Eamon Duggan. So I would now like to call on Councillor Pat Hines and invite him to lay a wreath at the grave of Eamon Douglas.
mBláth, Cortege Generalta, Tarragig, mBláth, Pig,
I've got a Margot we are also honoured to have here with us today Dr. Richard Mulcahy. Dr. Mulcahy, as many of you will know, is a son of Dick Mulcahy, former Commander-in-Chief of the Army, former Minister for Defence, and of course former leader of the Béal. And it's a great honour for us to have his son, Dr. Richard, here to honour his true colleague, Michael Collins, and our
An Caterun Deaver Glover, Ashari or Sloanaho. Arnahar Tarnav, Gane Fadanum, Padaga the Riot, Gane Faholler and Dolph Marniter Nav. Arnar on Lehu, Turguninu, Agsmarkun Arvika, Marwahid, Nel Darvekuni Fade, Agsnarlikshin, Igahawak, Silshin, no odd comment.
I'm sure you've all noticed the Sliabh beside us here, and I think we've all got the lift from the presence of the Sliabh because of its connection with Michael. Today by the presence of our Minister for Justice, Equality and Law Reform. I hope I've got that all right, Minister. And I think I would probably speak on behalf of all of us here to wish her well in what I suppose is a relatively new ministry for her, a very, very difficult ministry, as we all know. We, on behalf of everybody here, I want to wish you well, Minister, in the future. And I would not... I would now like to invite the Minister to place a wreath at the grave in honour of General Michael Collins.
mBláth, Cortege Generalta, Tarragig, mBláth, Pig,
Or a meal of mango to
And then the matter of some big types of student name come in. On Darun Deaver Glover, Took on Imagine Mercy Sarnav. Arnahar Tarnav, Beneath the Banner, the Dog of the Leaf, Beneath the Holler and Dog, Marniter Arnav. And Smakun Arveka, Marwahid, Darvekuni Fay, Oxnalikshin, Gahawak, Sershin, or Comment. Shake the words and on the graph, the Tonjun and Laugh, Fanny with the Vanok, Als is Spanje current Brunissen. Peter Bahalier Talon the Gross, the Tontian, the Lap to Spanje, Yigvan Ross, the Spanje current Brunissen.
I think I speak for everybody when I say that was an absolutely beautiful rendition of our national anthem. Just one thing I'd like to say, ladies and gentlemen, before I close here. I should have acknowledged earlier on the presence here of Simon Harris, Minister of State at the Department of Finance. I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether this is me or this microphone, but we seem to be having a problem. We don't seem to be connecting with each other for some reason or other. I don't know if you just heard what I said. I just wanted to acknowledge the presence here of Deputy Simon Harris, recently appointed Minister for State at the Department of Finance, and to wish him all the best in his new appointment. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our outdoor ceremonies here today, and we will now adjourn to the Milestone Gallery.
Good afternoon. Minister Harris, Minister Fitzgerald, you're very welcome. Indeed, you're all very welcome to the Milestone Gallery. It's fantastic to see such a crowd here. When I get up in the mornings, this place is far too big for me. When I go to bed at night, it's far too small for me. So you're all very welcome. I'd like to introduce you to Councillor William Béal to address you just before the lecture. William.
Thank you, George.
My role is that of Secretary of the Collins Griffith Commemoration Committee. And Minister of State, Deputy Senators, fellow councillors and ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining with us today to commemorate the 92nd anniversary of the death of General Michael Collins and President Arthur Griffith. As you've seen, we've had a different format this year, and having completed our outdoor activities, it's now to have our annual oration. And it's my role here today now to introduce our speaker this year. This year, the annual oration will be given by Dr. David Murphy, lecturer in military history at NUI Maynooth. Dr. Murphy is a graduate of University College Dublin and Trinity College Dublin. He has taught at both of these institutions and has also worked with the Royal Irish Academy and with the Irish Manuscripts Commission. In 2004, he became the first Irish scholar to be awarded a fellowship to the West Point Summer School in the States, Summer Seminar in Military History. In 2011, he became an Irish member on the Military Education Committee of the International Commission for Military History, a UNESCO-affiliated body, and he's also a member of the UK Royal United Services Institute. He has written numerous books, most recently on Lawrence of Arabia. So with a depth of academic knowledge of military history and related matters, both Irish and international, we're looking forward to your contribution and your presentation and oration here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David Murphy.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith. I'd like to thank Eddie and Jim Cairns of the committee for actually inviting me to come along and do this. I've always had a huge interest in both characters, and particularly Michael Collins. And if anybody ever visits my home, and depending on who you are, you're welcome to do that, you'll find over the fireplace there is that iconic photograph of Michael Collins. One of the first things I brought into my new house, and my new bride will tell you that I don't know how much longer that's going to be over the fireplace, but that's where it is at the moment. Two fascinating characters in Irish history and so fundamentally important. And as was mentioned earlier on today, in many ways, totally contrasting figures. Griffith, basically an urbanite, a man of the city. Collins, from a rural background, a man of the country, of the Irish countryside. One very, very intellectual, and on Collins' side, not a huge formal academic training. What also strikes me about them as well is that age group. There's an almost 20-year age gap between the two of them. So Griffith is very much a child of the 19th century, of the mid-19th century. And the influences on his life and his opinions are firmly based on that. And then when you look at Collins, is coming into the late 19th, early 20th century, much more radical time politically, much more radical time in terms of revolutionary activity. And he is very much a man of that period too. What also strikes me as well about both of them is that Griffith is a very public man. He is an editor of a newspaper. He is involved in politics. He's involved in the Gaelic League. If one goes to look for Griffith in the late 19th, early 20th century, you can find him. He's a public figure. Michael Collins, on the other hand, is a clandestine figure. In many ways, there are paradoxes there in that he stands as an MP for South Cork. Yet at the same time, when the War of Independence begins again, British intelligence, British police force, RIC in Ireland, haven't got a reliable photograph of him. And it is in his interest to operate in that clandestine mode. So huge contrast there and some similarities that we might get onto a bit later on. Arthur Griffith, a key figure in Irish politics in the late 19th, early 20th century, and in many ways a forgotten figure. I mean, Dermot Ferreter has mentioned this only recently. It would be difficult to find such a fundamentally important figure about how so little is known and about whom so little has been written about. Involved with the Nation newspaper, involved with the Gaelic League, and I always think that period that he went to South Africa in 1897 to 1898 is a fundamentally important phase for him, as that it radicalised him politically. And then when he comes back, when the Second Anglo-Boer War breaks out in 1899, he is one of the leading figures with Maud Gonne and the MacBrides in the Transvaal Committee, a pro-Boer, anti-British committee that basically holds demonstrations in Dublin and all around the country. One of their particularly good stunts was to hoist the Boer flag over city halls around Ireland to make the point, which was a reasonably neat trick. And that episode fundamentally politicised Irish society in that period. And there's Donald McCracken has made a huge argument that it begins a move towards a new wave of popular protest, a new wave of popular movement towards a resolution of what will the Anglo-Irish relationship be in the 20th century. And a fascinating character as well in that Griffith is internationally aware, not only in South Africa, but he's aware of events in India, he's aware of events in Egypt, where he sees the parallels between, say, the Indian National Congress, an Irish Parliamentary Party, and Irish separatists who are trying to redefine the relationship within the empire. And he's aware of that. So in some ways, quite a radical figure. And then in other ways, quite conservative. If you see later on in his career, he will explore the whole idea of Ireland adopting a position like the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. So you redefine Ireland within the empire on that basis. Return to the 1782 constitution, abolish the Act of Union, and have some kind of dual monarchy home rule position for Ireland. So it's an incredibly nuanced political development that we see Griffith go through. And then, well, I suppose what he's usually remembered for now, the foundation of Sinn Féin and his role within Sinn Féin. But a fundamentally important figure then in the treaty negotiations of 1921, realised that what was being offered, as Collins realised, was not satisfactory, was not necessarily what we wanted, but was willing to make that compromise to go forward. And then president of the Second Dáil, an important role as the treaty debate continued, as Ireland began to fracture. A man who was incredible kind of like integrity politically, willing to fulfil that role and try and maintain a semblance of government and maintain the integrity of the Second Dáil. Until his very untimely death, 12th of August, 1922. And I was struck today as we came past the memorial, that very peculiar memorial in Glasnevin Cemetery, the half pillar, the uncompleted pillar. A man who, when you see photographs of him campaigning on the treaty debate weeks before his death, looks like a man in his 60s, maybe older, but he's only 50. He has aged incredibly in the course of his political life and the strains that he's been put under recently. Michael Collins, perhaps better known, at least technically, and I might talk about that in a second. Interesting figure, again, a very basic formal education, by trade or profession an accountant, active in the GAA, active in the IRB, active in the Irish Volunteers from its earliest days, and president of the GPO in 1916. Extremely lucky to a certain extent, not being senior enough at that point to be singled out for execution. He is a reasonably minor figure in 1916. He's ADC to Joseph Mary Plunkett, so not singled out for execution. And then that formative period in Frongach, in prison, in Wales, and then he comes back to engage in politics, and then gradually into the War of Independence, Civil War, and as Commander-in-Chief of the National Army. I'm often fascinated when I travel abroad for work, and you go through various locations, and you find that the War of Independence in military colleges and various military colleges I've visited is taught, the Irish War of Independence. If you go into the bookshop in West Point, the US Military Academy, you will find Tom Barry's Guerrilla Days in Ireland. And there is a module taught to American cadets on what not to do in an ambush, how to set up your own ambushes, which I find fascinating. And then I talk to Irish students and they may not know who Tom Barry is. So American cadets have that awareness. Also, a couple of years ago, I went over to give a lecture at the US Command and Staff course in Fort Leavenworth. They have a whole elective on the Irish War of Independence. And it deals with the military aspects, it deals with the intelligence war. So it's very much out there, the importance of that phase. Now, I leave it to yourselves to decide whether or not the Americans have learned from those electives and their recent military experiences. But, you know, you can think on that. But Collins, as intelligence chief, So much, I mean, he is a man to a certain extent learning on the job, and it's a very dangerous job that he's actually engaged in. And he learns his tradecraft on the spot. And so much of what he and his colleagues do are now standard issues in the playbook. Dead letter drops, kind of moving addresses, taking various identities. I mean, it's fascinating that, you know, all the way up until the treaty negotiations, British authorities really do not know what Michael Collins looks like. Really, they have some couple of hazy photographs, and that's all they've got to base themselves on. And then also willing to do the targeted killing, to recognise the operatives in your opposition who are dangerous, who are damaging, and you must take out the equation. From our point of view, from a modern point of view, that impacts on our sensibilities, and we have difficulties about that. But from their point of view, from Collins's point of view, these issues had to be done. And then also something we quite often forget about, we think about the military thing, but he also has a financial brief. And the whole idea of the national loan that's going to fund the Dáil, it's going to fund a new state, it's going to fund the war against the British. An incredible amount of organisation into that. And estimates of up to £400,000, which when you think in, say, 1919, 1920 scenario, that's an incredible amount of money that he's organising, managing, and to use a modern term, laundering into various locations. It's all a bit Breaking Bad, really. So, post-treaty, chairman of the provisional government, commander-in-chief, until his untimely death, just 10 days after Griffith at Béal and mBláth. So two fundamentally important figures. One, a key figure, public figure. One, a key figure, a more clandestine figure. And this was mentioned today, and the question is often put to me, what would have happened if both of them had lived? I don't really like getting into that level of counterfactual, the what if, because you can take it to bizarre and ludicrous proportions. All I think we can be certain of is that Ireland would have been different. Now, different in what way, we don't know. But it would have been different. Some people would say that Michael Collins would have become a dictator. Some people suggest that he would have been a modernising Ataturk figure, okay, like the Turkish model. But we're not sure. All we do know is different. And if we get into kind of like unpacking that, it probably is not a very useful exercise. So did the two men have anything in common? I think organisationally, they have the same kind of mindset. They can politically organise, they can financially organise, and from Collins's point of view, he can also do military organisation and intelligence organisation at the same level. So they're both great organisers. I think they're in touch with the people. I mean, one of his last entries in his diary when he's doing his tour of West Cork before his death, the people are splendid. He's gone out there into a particularly dangerous kind of like environment to talk to his people, and he is doing that. And also Griffith, if you look at even some of the footage, film footage that survives of the treaty kind of like meetings in the street, quite often guns are produced to intimidate speakers. And he is public speaking in that environment during the treaty debates, during the treaty period. So in touch with the people and persuasive, I think, within that. Also, I think hard-working. And one could argue in the case of Griffith, literally the man worked himself to death. He had been hospitalised in the previous weeks. He was out again, and literally coming out of government buildings, he collapses for what happens to be the terminal episode. And he, as a 50-year-old man, he's worked himself to death. And also that sense of duty and self-sacrifice. And I almost hesitate to say those words these days because they become almost like dirty words. The idea of duty. If I say to one of my young students, like, you know, that it might be actually your duty to go to such and such a funeral or whatever it is, he or she will look at me askance. The idea of things that you may not want to do, but you have to do. Self-sacrifice, that the world just doesn't provide you with stuff, that to get to your end game, you may have to give something to make that happen. So, are they forgotten figures in Irish history? One could argue the case with Griffith. I think definitely there's been so little written about the man. He has been so badly explored historically. I think you can also make the case with Collins. It's interesting, we're gathered here today and we are all, shall we say we're all true believers? We're all here for a reason. I'm fascinated with it if I have a class and I say, name me a major Irish military leader or a major Irish figure. And invariably, Collins will be mentioned. And then you say, okay, why? well, he beat the British in the War of Independence. And then I say, okay, the follow-up question, how did he do that? And that's usually where it dries up. So there's that awareness that this man is an iconic figure in Irish history, but there is not an awareness of what put him in that position. Why do people have his photograph over the fireplace? Some people as well, I think, could criticise events like this, these kind of commemorations, as commemorating men of violence, or commemorating men who condone violence. It is an interesting thing to think about, and there is validity in that. But in the context of the War of Independence, 1919 to 21, and in the Civil War period, revolutionary violence, Civil War violence is very brutal. It's a question of, can we get to an end game without this violence actually taking place? I was at a talk in 2008 in Paris, and it was actually after an incident in Afghanistan. And President Sarkozy, who you probably wouldn't be aware of many of his great quotes, but he was talking about an incident in Afghanistan, and he started the speech. He said, freedom comes for a price, and quite often that price is paid in blood. And they were the first two lines of his speech. And it stopped the audience in its tracks, because we like to think of freedom and kind of like republican government and democracy, but we don't like to think that maybe back in the 1920s blood had to be spilled to get us there. So it's something to think about. In terms of kind of like the use and abuse of history, what can we actually derive from these kind of like historical commemorations? Some people would say, and a lot of my colleagues would say, that history actually has no lessons. What we do is we record events, we try to ascertain what actually happened in the context of that moment. But are there lessons to be learned from events like the War of Independence, the Civil War? Are there lessons to be learned from people like Collins and people like Griffith? I believe actually that there might be. I think when you look at their lives, and if you burrow into them, you will see two people in immensely trying circumstances trying to essentially give birth to a new country, act as midwife to a new country and a new democracy. At a very, very difficult period in their time. And if you look into their qualities, I think there are lessons there for how we approach our life today. I'm fascinated in terms for, I suppose, for politicians. We'll go easy on politicians because there's some in the audience. But those ideas of the duty, the self-sacrifice. I mean, if you look at either life, Collins or Griffith, there are examples there definitely to follow. I also think from the point of view of the public, Isaiah Berlin came up with this concept of the kind of like positive and negative freedom, the rights and the duties of citizenship. I think we could be accused as a nation in the last 10 years or so to be becoming very concerned about the rights of citizenship and maybe forgetting the duties of citizenship. So I think in the light of this, we're coming into a decade of commemorations now, and we're going to be marking various events up to 2022 and beyond. It might be a moment to use these commemorations to a very positive advantage. Take a moment, reset ourselves. Look at our country, look what has evolved in the last century. Think about how that has actually evolved. Then maybe ask ourselves, is this country the country that we want? And if not, what do we do to change it? And that is everybody. That is, we can't just look at Leinster House, cannot just look at the houses of the Oireachtas. That is all of us. What are our duties as citizens, as well as an awareness as our rights of citizens? So before I get too preachy, I think I'll wind up there. I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and again for the invite. I think a very important kind of like occasion today, and Jim was telling me that the numbers in this are growing year on year. So I hope at this occasion, Collins Griffith, and other occasions over the next decade, the numbers will continue to grow, that more people will start coming to this. And at the far end of it, we might have something positive, that it's not just an empty act, that we come away with an idea of our country, how it came about, and where we wanted to go for the next century. Thank you very much.
On behalf of Glasnevin Trust, a few thank yous. Firstly, to David Murphy for an excellent speech. And David, you nailed what we in Glasnevin Trust are trying to do. This Collins Griffith commemoration is one of several commemorations that have taken place here over the last few weeks, and there will be more happening over the next few weeks and next few years. And your summary of what we expect, all we want to do is to tell the story. The diversity of this cemetery is perhaps emphasised no more than in about 2 hours' time we're going to have a commemoration lecture for Roger Casement. Everywhere in this cemetery that you turn, there is point and counterpoint. And these two men that we've commemorated today are important parts of our history. In your lecture, you said that Michael Collins had no formal education, a very basic education. He became an accountant. Well, as a history graduate who calls himself an accountant, I can certainly relate to that. But they are important men. And you said, are they forgotten or not forgotten? I think that's what this decade of centenaries is about. It's not about us being up here, being moralistic, sententious, or saying who's right or who's wrong, but it's encouraging people to learn about this part of our history, such a complex part of our history. And when we go on to look at Casement this afternoon, the complexities are huge. And how many, we had the Asgard commemoration a few weeks ago, and how many people knew who the leaders of that really were and what background they came from. And it's just putting that story out so that people can learn, because there was a deficit in the way our history was taught in the past. And these commemorations hopefully will help to fill them. I'd also like to congratulate the Collins Griffith Society for carrying on this tradition for 92 years. It's important that societies like these are recognized for what they are, as being a healing body, not being a divisive body. The commemorations that we carry on here, we only have a few boundaries. The boundaries are that they're respectful, dignified, and authentic. And today was all those three, and I congratulate you. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you, John, for your comments. And first of all, on behalf of the Collins Griffith Commemoration Society and our committee, I'd like to extend our thanks to Dr. David Murphy for your oration here today. I think you provided, and I'm sure you'll agree, a very refreshing perspective on the personalities of both Collins and Griffith, both as individuals and as a unique partnership, I suppose, but also in reflecting on what this decade of commemorations means. So thank you again, David. I would like to just extend a few further thank yous on behalf of the committee. First of all, before this event today in Glasnevin, we had our annual Mass commemoration in Berkeley Road Church before this, and I'd like to thank the priest, the sacristan, and the altar boys again for their contribution there. Also our patrons, Fergus O'Brien and John O'Leary, for doing the readings, and Catherine Byrne TD, who as always sings at that Mass. So thank you very much. I wish to thank all who participated here in the cemetery today, starting with the members of the committee. I'd like to thank Eamon Lord and Peter Gaffney, who every year set up the banners and tend to the wreaths and the arrangements on the day. To our PRO, Seamus Scally, to Jim Kearns, who arranged and liaised with our speaker, to Geraldine Dalton, who led the prayers, to our singer, Anna Brady, who I'm sure you all agree was absolutely fantastic, to Louise and Marita Cosgrave, who arranged the refreshments that we're going to have here in a few moments. I'd also like to thank our wreath layers, Minister Francis Fitzgerald, Councillor Pat Hines, and Mr. Richard Mulcahy. I'd like to thank particularly the members of the Defence Forces who joined us this year for the first time in a long time, and who really helped raise this event and make it something special. So thank you very much, and hopefully their presence will be an annual event as we continue to ramp up this ceremony over the decade of commemoration and in the lead up to the centenary of the deaths of both General Collins and President Griffith. I'd particularly like to thank both our MCs, our chairman, Eddie Nolan, chairman of the Collins Griffith Committee, and the CEO of Glasnevin Trust, Mr. George McCullough. On that point, I'd like to, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, I'd like to thank Glasnevin Trust for what they have done, not just only in maintaining the graves of General Collins and President Griffith, but in maintaining the graves of all who lay here. This cemetery is a fantastic national treasure, a relic, and in memory of all those who lay here. It will play a starring role over the next few years as we remember the decade of commemorations. 2 weeks ago we saw the unveiling of the Cross of Remembrance for those who died in the Great War. As was mentioned this afternoon, we have the first annual Roger Casement lecture. Well,